Xinjiang separatists blame for terror attack in Kunming. Ukraine calls for UN efforts to stop Russian military intervention, and a protest against violence following an attack on a journalist.
Good evening. Mainland authorities have vowed to punish those responsible for last night's brazen attack in Yunnan, which left at least 29 people dead. More than 130 others were wounded after the attackers rampaged their way through Kunming railway station, slashing and stabbing anyone in their path. Local officials have blamed the violence on separatists from the rest of Xinjiang region.
Heavy security in Kunming today after last night's horrific attack at the city's main railway station. Authorities promise swift retribution for those behind the carnage, which has left a nation in shock. The attack happened at around 9 p.m. when a group of assailants dressed in black started slashing and stabbing randomly at people at the railway station. Survivors said there was panic and chaos as people tried to flee whichever way they could. People were running this way, the survivor said. I ran with them. I saw people being killed. It was terrible. Another man saw one of the attackers holding a long sword, hacking relentlessly at anyone in his way. Shop and restaurant workers said hundreds of people had fled into their stores seeking refuge. Police managed to shoot 4 attackers dead and capture some others, but it wasn't enough for many of the victims. Word of the violence spread quickly on mainland social media, with graphic pictures that showed bodies covered in blood. Speaking today, Security Chief Meng Jianzhu condemned the violence and vowed to find those responsible and bring them to justice. Meng, who is also a member of the Communist Party Politburo, made an emergency trip to Kunming, visiting the train station and wounded in hospital. State media quoted the Kunming authorities as saying evidence at the crime scene showed the attack was carried out by separatists from Xinjiang, a region which has long been a security concern for Beijing. If it's indeed the work of Xinjiang separatists, the attack would be a major escalation in the simmering unrest. It's another incident in which people from Xinjiang have been blamed for carrying out a shocking attack so far from their homeland. It follows a smaller incident in Beijing's Tiananmen Square last October, when a jeep ploughed into a crowd of people and burst into flames, killing several people. Last night's violence comes at a sensitive time as the nation prepares for the annual sessions of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and the National People's Congress.
And locally, a mass protest against violence this afternoon following the brutal attack on former Mingpao chief editor Kevin Lau. Organisers say 13,000 people took part in a protest march from the central government offices to the police headquarters. Police put the figure at 8,600 at the height of the event. Stephanie Choi reports.
"They can't kill us all," chanted the protesters as they marched in support of Kevin Lau and press freedom and in protest against violence.
Freedom of speech and freedom of press is already endangered in Hong Kong. But I think Mr. Kevin Lau's attack is a triggering event only.
Held by the Press Coalition Against Violence, comprising prominent media organizations, the demonstration was considered by many an opportunity for journalists to put aside their differences and unite against violence.
The message they've sent to the attacker is, instead of weakening the Hong Kong media, they have turned us more vocal and united.
We are giving a very strong message to the community that the media organizations, the media itself, can act together in against violence and threats to our community. This is something we cannot tolerate.
The man who's slated to be the next chief editor of the Mingpao newspaper, Chong Tian-xiong, was also at the rally.
Hong Kong is famous for rule and law and rules of law. Well, you can't simply scold people, you can't simply hit people. Not to say you want to slash people, you chop people, you kill people. That's really too much. You cannot accept in any civilized world.
Outside the police headquarters, protesters called for the protection of press freedom by making sure justice is served in the hunt for Lau's attackers. The blue ribbons the demonstrators are pasting on these banners symbolize their support for the freedom of speech. Prior to the march, protesters dressed in black and sporting blue ribbons stood silently at Tema Park in a protest against violence organized by the Hong Kong Journalists Association. The journalists wrote their blessings on a large banner, which will later be given to Lau as a sign of support. Organizers also played a recording to demonstrators with Lau urging journalists to stand fearless against intimidation and to uphold truth and justice. Stephanie Choi, TVB News.
Turning overseas now, Russian troops have taken over the strategic Crimea region of Ukraine without firing a shot. The bold move comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin declared the right to invade his neighbour. As James Aiken reports, Ukraine's political crisis is turning into a tug of war between Washington and Moscow.
Russian troops took over the Crimea after Russia's parliament granted President Vladimir Putin authority to use the military to protect Russian interests in Ukraine. At an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, Ukraine led the call to do everything possible to stop the Russian military advance.
This action by the Russian Federation constitutes an act of aggression against the state of Ukraine, a severe violation of international law, posing a serious threat to sovereignty and territorial integrity of our country.
But Vitaly Churkin, Russia's ambassador to the UN, responded that Russia must sideline what he called radicals who pose threats to Russians in Ukraine, and that Russia has the right to protect its interests there. The response from the US was blunt.
It is ironic that the Russian Federation regularly goes out of its way in this chamber to emphasize the sanctity of national borders and of sovereignty. But Russian actions in Ukraine are violating the sovereignty of Ukraine and pose a threat to peace and security.
But action from the UN Security Council appears unlikely. As a permanent member, Russia has veto power and can block any resolution criticizing or sanctioning Moscow. Ukraine's armed forces have been put on full combat alert, and the country's newly installed leadership has warned Russia that any military intervention in the country could lead to war.
Keep on fighting for your country.
With opposition to Russia's intervention growing louder, U.S. President Barack Obama spent 90 minutes on the phone with Putin, calling on him to pull his forces back. But it appears the Kremlin is unlikely to heed the call. For now, the U.S. focus remains on exploring diplomatic options, such as punitive actions that could exert enough pressure on Moscow to back off. James Aiken, TVB News.
Anti-government protesters in the Thai capital dismantled some of their sites today and moved to a park in the centre of the city. This as election reruns were held in 5 provinces where voting was disrupted last month by demonstrators seeking to unseat caretaker Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra. There were no reports of violence in today's vote, even though balloting was disrupted in 18% of the constituencies last month. Election reruns planned for April in other provinces have been suspended pending a court decision on procedures. Meanwhile, anti-government demonstrators in Bangkok pulled out of some of their protest sites today and moved to Lumpini Park. Protest leader Suthep Thaugsuban said this is not a move to retreat. Instead, he called it an adjustment in their manoeuvre for fighting. Protest numbers have dwindled in recent days following gun and grenade attacks on various protest sites. Since late November, a total of 20 people have been killed in protest-related violence in Bangkok and 3 in the eastern province of Trat.
More anti-government rallies in Turkey, with protesters calling on the Prime Minister to resign amid corruption allegations against him. The latest accusations of corruption against Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his AK party followed the leak of audio recordings alleged to be of the Premier and his son discussing how to get rid of large amounts of cash. Erdogan has denied the voices were him and his son and say it's a plot to discredit him.
Egypt's new government was sworn in last night in a limited reshuffle which keeps the powerful ministers of defence and interior in place under a new prime minister named days earlier. The new cabinet keeps Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as the country's defence minister. He's widely expected to make a bid for the presidency, although this hasn't been confirmed. The country's interior minister in charge of police, Mohammed Ibrahim, also remains the same.
And still ahead, another protest against mainland tourists. Funding for a 3D projection show along Victoria Harbour. And carnival time in Brazil and elsewhere.